Well, welcome everybody. My name is Oliver Dodd, one of 3 co-directors based at the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Rizwaan Sabir, who'll be talking to us about Britain's counter-terrorism practices and the policing of Muslims. Rizwaan will be discussing themes pertaining to his recent book, published by Pluto Press in 2022, titled The Suspect, Counterterrorism, Islam and the Security State. As usual for CSSGJ talks, Rizwaan will be presenting for approximately 45 minutes, and we will follow this with a similar amount of time for the Q&A. Obviously, the talk today is of special importance given how Islamophobia is currently rife. So we're very pleased to have you here today, Rizwaan. It's really an honor for the CSSGJ to be able to host you. So Rizwaan, over to you.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Oliver, and thank you, of course, to Andreas Bieler and Tony Burns for setting this up in a strange way. I'm sure they've already considered and felt this, but it feels like we've done the full circle. It all started at Nottingham in one respect, and we've now done the full circle and returned to an institute that used to be affiliated to Nottingham, but no longer is. It's independent. But anyway, thank you very much for having me. I suppose what makes the book and today's session more kind of relevant and pertinent to the story of the University of Nottingham and the Centre is that many people sort of know and understand the broad parameters of what I'm going to speak about and why. But let me summarize for those who aren't aware. Now, I've written a book and it was published last year and it's called The Suspect, as Oliver said, and it basically provides a comprehensive account of my arrest and detention for suspected terrorism in May 2008 for a total period of 7 days, 6 nights and 7 days, my release without charge, and around 3.5 years of subsequent surveillance undertaken by the authorities in reference to my activism, my politics, my ideas, and of course my academic research and my investigations. And all of this is documented in that particular book. Now, what's interesting and what I want to sort of focus on in today's talk is what prompted the arrest and also how the arrest was able to be carried out and what that reveals essentially about what the sorts of policies are that are being integrated into our domestic policing and criminal justice system. So if we start off with a very broad understanding of what drove the arrest, it was in essence the possession of a primary document nicknamed the Al-Qaeda Training Manual that had been placed into the public domain by the United States Department of Justice on their particular website, because the rules in America say that whenever a document is used to prosecute a person, then that document should be made available and made open source, and it should therefore be placed into the public domain. So that's what the State Department essentially did. They placed the Al-Qaeda Training Manual into the public domain because it had been used to prosecute 2 of the East Africa embassy bombers. They were operational in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And they blew up the US embassy, and they were then subsequently prosecuted in New York. So the document, when I accessed it, it actually said on the front that this is a government exhibit, and it had been used in the prosecution of these known suspects. So when I downloaded and had a look at the document, I thought it was going to be very useful for my upcoming PhD, which I was crazily applying for a scholarship for, but also for my master's dissertation, which I was actually writing on Al-Qaeda and Hamas, very timely. And of course, none of that happened in the end because the document which I had sent to my colleague, Hisham Yeza, a friend, editor of the political magazine Ceasefire and a member of administrative staff, the principal administrator in the School of Modern Languages, was discovered by his line manager and subsequently reported to the University of Nottingham's registrar, who, despite all his claims, did not conduct a risk assessment because there is never any evidence provided or furnished, including to my Member of Parliament, Vernon Coker, at the time, that any such risk assessment took place. It was basically a decision that he unilaterally took based on his own assumptions, which we'll come to in a moment, reported the matter to the university's security department, who was led by a former special branch officer who subsequently informed his colleagues at Nottinghamshire Special Branch of what essentially had been detected on the computer of this administrative staff member. The police subsequently then escalated the matter to the newly developed or newly formed West Midlands Counterterrorism Unit, and they subsequently launched what was codenamed Operation Minerva, ironically named after the Greek goddess of wisdom. The police arrived on campus, arrested my co-accused Hisham Yeza, and eventually myself within around an hour or so of Hisham's arrest. We were both taken into custody and we were held for a total period of 7 days. Now, what's important, I think, to emphasize about this story, which I've told many times and I document in detail in the book, is essentially that, just give me 1 second, I'm just going to adjust something on my screen, is essentially how the law had permitted the state to do what it did. So the law stipulates that anybody who is in possession of a piece of information that is considered to be useful to terrorists should be and can be arrested, detained, and prosecuted under the law. So this is what is known as a strict liability offense. It's like a red light. You violate a red light, even with blue lights for a police car flashing behind you, you've technically still committed an offense and can be prosecuted, regardless of your reason for violating the red light. So despite the fact that the document was possessed for purely academic purposes, as we've always had to argue and defend, even whilst I was in police custody, the law is actually quite clear on this matter. The law says that being in possession of a terrorist information considered useful to terrorists, irrespective of your intent, is a criminal offence. And this isn't just one law that we were being considered for violating, but actually many of the terrorism offences. Section 5 of the Terrorism Act 2001, acts preparatory to terrorism, for example, are all structured along this strict liability framework that says you commit an offence irrespective of your intent. The same with the encouragement of terrorism. If you glorify an act of terrorism, for example, that took place in the past, for example, the activities and actions of the American revolutionaries or the resistance to Nazi occupation of France, you are committing a criminal offence, because the law says that if you glorify or celebrate such an act, irrespective of what the outcome is, if you're reckless in your conduct, then you can technically be prosecuted. Now, of course, it's highly unlikely that celebrating the activities of the American revolutionaries is going to be prosecuted in the courts. But if that same logic is applied to a more contemporary example, the likelihood is that it may be prosecuted. So law, of course, oftentimes is said to be, in the liberal reading anyway, a neutral arbiter between right and wrong. But actually, oftentimes, the law is more a question of power. And if you look at any of the historic tyrannies that have taken place, whether it's slavery or colonialism or apartheid or Israeli apartheid that's happening now, oftentimes it's it's not just executive power that drives it, but actually law. So law is more oftentimes more a question of power than it is of justice or what constitutes right or wrong. And I just wanted to emphasize this point around law to start with. And the reason is because when the arrest happened and we were subsequently released after 7 days, and I'm kind of missing a significant chunk of what happened during that period, one thing that was central was the downplaying of what had happened and what the state had done because it was lawful. So what the law seeks to do is it seeks to essentially legitimize any form of state violence because it's ultimately grounded in law. So in this respect, you can arrest somebody and you can prosecute and you can actually convict them based on the existence of a strict liability terrorism offense, which actually completely discounts their reason for possessing a particular piece of information. Now, that within itself is frightening, but what becomes even more frightening is because it's legal, it's likely to be not challenged. So what we find is that the state at this present moment in time has all of these different policies in play that are justified through a legal architecture that has been specifically created to essentially allow the state to take excessive and oftentimes heavy-handed action against completely ordinary behavior without proving that individuals are actually involved in anything criminal. So if you were to dissect the facts and the statistics, and I'm using the Home Office's own data to make this point, other than the periods of around 2014 to 17, which is the height of the Syrian civil war, and a lot of people are traveling to Syria to engage in potential combat, potential because there's no proof that they actually are going to, it's all based on intelligence. The figures reveal that most people who have been arrested, charged, and subsequently prosecuted and found guilty of terrorism offences in the UK have been convicted for non-violent terrorism offences, predominantly Section 58 of the Terrorism Act 2000, which relates to the possession of information regardless of intent. So what that reveals is that the state has implemented quite a broad and draconian legal system which allows them to take action against somebody who is not actually involved in violence through the law and the legitimacy that the law oftentimes grants. And what does that lead to? It leads to no real resistance other than from either activists or lawyers or human rights campaigners. For the majority, because the action is lawful, it is considered to be appropriate. Now, what's interesting about this issue of law, and this is something that I discovered when I started doing my PhD research and have subsequently remained interested in, is how this technique of using the law in order to undermine and basically confine suspects and individuals who may potentially go on to become engaged in political violence or acts of resistance against the state is not new, but actually is rooted in colonial counterinsurgency, which then morphs into what we have today, contemporary counterinsurgency. So colonial counterinsurgency has always historically used law. So if we look at the work, for example, of Frank Kitson, who was central in the struggle in the British campaign in the north of Ireland, or you look at the work of Robert Thompson, again, a classic colonial counterinsurgent who's quite active against the communist threat in Malaysia and that part of the world, Vietnam. They both emphasized how the law is not actually it's not going to contain or limit your violence as the state, but actually it's going to enable it. So don't think that we have to operate outside of the law, but actually counterinsurgency war and fighting warfare, and I'll define this term in a moment, is going to become a lot easier for you to engage in if your actions are justified through law because of the public consent that you can build, the justification that you can give if you base your violence through the use of law. And there's a very famous quote, and I always use this to teach my students around this topic of counterinsurgency and law, but it says, quote, Kitson, quote, that the law is nothing more than the propaganda cover for the disposal of unwanted members of society. And this is quite a powerful quote that shows how the law is used to legitimize and provide cover for a series of highly dubious and questionable acts of state violence against ordinary people in a way that will not lead to mass resistance or campaigning against. So the law in this respect is used against people. And this is the most frightening thing, that had it not been for the support of some people who are currently sat in this meeting or this event, and the support of people like Rod Thornton, for example, and a good, strong family and community support structure that I had the benefit of, I may have found myself quite easily being prosecuted for this particular offense. And I think that having the sorts of social capital that I did, and I've never really been able to tell directly the people who helped me, that I think having their support and the fact that a lot of them were European and white certainly provided me with an element of support that could not be ignored. If it was just racialized Muslim communities who were coming to my aid and my support, it would have been a very different thing. But as white scholars and academics who were campaigning and actually saying that actually we know Rizwaan, he's not what you are claiming he is, that provided the state with something that they could not ignore. So the racialized dimension to this gave me that added advantage that others just don't have. And part and parcel of writing the book and centering all of these sorts of arguments as well as the story is not to say, oh my God, I am the only one who has suffered. On the contrary, it's to say, I have to use the tools that I have in order to show how this particular series of laws and policies has been integrated into everyday and ordinary counterterrorism practices, policies, and laws. And it's affecting and harming so many people, but generally some of the most vulnerable in our society, in our communities, who aren't able to draw on the support of white scholars and academics in Russell Group institutions who can essentially support them and defend them when they are finding themselves in trouble. And it's about sharing that responsibility to make something visible. So the law is used to contain and confine in order to legitimize what the state is doing, which shows how the law is weaponized. But also at the same time, you have the integration of so many different dimensions of what's oftentimes called counterinsurgency or irregular warfare. So there's four main dimensions to counterinsurgency warfare. One is using law in order to take preemptive action against suspects and people that you feel may engage in violence against you. So this ties into the military mantra that it's better to prevent conflict than it is to actually fight conflict. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is the use of surveillance technology. And this is something I want to talk about specifically in reference to the Nottingham case, but more broadly in relation to the prevent policy. The third pillar is the use or the integration of civil and military power. And this is pertinent and central to what happens at Nottingham, because we essentially have a civilian surveillance force being utilized in the reporting of the discovery of this document that then triggers the security state to take action. So we can see that merger between civil and military power. And the fourth dimension of counterinsurgency, or the fourth pillar, so to speak, is what's known officially as strategic communication, which is basically a sophisticated way of saying actions communicate messages. So let's undertake actions that communicate the message that we are trying to share. That action could be coercive, or it could be persuasive. So these are the main 4 pillars of counterinsurgency. Now, one of the things that goes to the essence and the root of counterinsurgency is preemptive action. The idea of fighting conflict before it breaks out, or preventing the emergence of resistance before it actually engages power. And this is where the work of Stephen Lukes has been really powerful for me, where he talks about how the power is at its most effective when it denies and prevents resistance from even emerging. People don't even realize, in one respect, that they are having this power exercised over them, so they don't resist. And that's power at its most effective. So basically, systems of hegemony or hegemonic power. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this approach to fighting terrorism has become hegemonic. This idea of using and engaging civilian partnerships in conjunction with, for example, universities or the health service or doctors, mental health practitioners, with community workers, and so on, and so the list is long. This is all part and parcel of securitizing the public sector and civil society, but also using civil society in a Gramscian sense to essentially ensure that political society or the government or the executive can continue to remain in power and that no real resistance or challenge emerges to question the status quo. So when we look at what happens at Nottingham, we find 2 pillars immediately activated that draw their inspiration from counterinsurgency. One of them is surveillance, and one of them is the civil-military partnership. So let's take surveillance first. We know at Nottingham, for instance, that the Palestinian society predominantly was under active surveillance by the police service, and it was being fed information by the University of Nottingham's security personnel. We know this because we've got it in black and white. And I provide the intelligence logs in the book, and I provide the context to show what was happening and the sorts of language and the sorts of vocabulary that is being used against peaceful, non-violent students who were engaging in what I think is positive political citizenship whilst they are university students. And the language is quite revealing, because the language suggests that these students are not just an organic student organization that's emerged to resist what they feel is an unfair exercise of Israeli violence, but they're constructing it as being part and parcel of some organized criminal syndicate that operates around the globe and has its long hands in all corners of the globe. It's almost like this international network of Palestinian terrorists that the state is constructing these students as. And I'm no different here. In the statement that is given on the morning of my arrest for terrorism, the deputy head of the university security is briefing the police predominantly on my pro-Palestinian activism in order to help the police profile me as a potential terrorist. When I am in custody and the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS lawyers are discussing with counterterrorism officers as to whether I should be charged with a terrorism offense or released, one of the things that is central to their assessment is my involvement and my engagement with the Palestinian society. The fact that I have attended demonstrations on campus in support of Palestine, the fact that I am engaging in pro-Palestinian advocacy, that I am attending talks that are being undertaken at university by Palestinian advocates and others. So this information, and of course, all of the friends that the state and counterterrorism police seem to be interested in are those who are either members of the Palestinian society or have been known to be associated with members of the Palestinian society. So Palestine almost becomes a litmus test to determine who is a potential terrorist here. Who should we take action against? What are their views on Israel and Palestine? And this is something that I'm actually directly questioned on whilst I'm in custody, if I recall correctly. So what we find through these regimes of surveillance is that one, ordinary student behavior becomes constructed as being part and parcel of political violence. The engagement with academic scholarship that relies upon primary documentation is criminalized, even when the source of that information is actually very public. And had a proper, thorough assessment, risk assessment, and engagement with the relevant experts on campus been done, it would have been quite clear and quite quickly made visible that this is actually the nature of the document. None of this, of course, was done because in the hype and the hysteria that has infected public institutions, which are run by people, and people are not islands. No matter how enlightened people may be who run universities or part of universities, actually, they are subject to their own biases and their own prejudices. And we can see this clearly coming into its own form during the reporting of that manual, that had the moral panic that had been internalized by members of the management not allowed itself to get to the level it did. And if just some basic checks were done, I would not be here probably talking to you about this story, if at all, even talking to you about this topic. So what we can see is through that system of surveillance, ordinary behavior, student behavior, primary research, and student activism is all criminalized and constructed as being something inherently dangerous to the realm and something that is worthy of constant and ongoing surveillance. And that surveillance isn't just related to me. The documents that were released to me via my lawyers and my own investigations reveal that the Palestinian Society was under surveillance before my arrest. So this is something that is ongoing, and I've little doubt that this is still going on, especially given the situation now. In fact, I reckon it's probably intensified and worsened compared to what it was, and especially when the breakout of violence takes the sort of form that it is at the moment. So we can see surveillance being completely normalized, and also we can see how that military and civilian, or security and civilian boundary or distinction is completely blurred. Now, the question is, what is the harm that emerges if you blur the boundary between civilians and military personnel, or security personnel and civilians? Or you basically say that actually civilian personnel working within civil society, like doctors, like nurses, like academics and teachers, are part and parcel of the war effort now. Well, first and foremost, you are basically securitizing the entire terrain. So the space of culture has now been securitized. And what you're actually saying is that I am integrating coercion into this space. So civil society, which is meant to be the space of cultural contestation, ideological disagreement, and debate, is actually not that at all. It's actually shrouded, or rather has an armor, in the words of Gramsci, of coercion that shadows and surrounds it. So how much freedom do we actually have within these spaces? And I would say we have a sense of freedom, but actually when you exercise those rights to speak, then you are very likely to find yourself under some kind of investigation or some kind of coercive pressure. And we can see this, for example, in the latest stories around Israel and Palestine, when members of the academic community who are protected by countless laws, including the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, academic freedom and notions of academic freedom in various pieces of law, are being investigated for saying completely lawful, legitimate, and democratic things. So what the state has done through its counterterrorism paradigm is penetrated civil society in order to coerce people in order to not speak, or to discipline people into not speaking. Now, not only do these sorts of actions create a coercive effect, but they create that chilling effect that discourages others from speaking about these particular topics. And I think this is where the fourth pillar that I spoke about, strategic communication, becomes absolutely essential to understand, is that historically, information is used to explain. Yeah. So, for example, leaflets are thrown out of an aircraft, a military aircraft, over an Iraqi city, for example, to say, we are going to bomb military garrisons belonging to the Iraqi army, so you may want to leave this area. It's a simple instruction to say, we are going to do this. If you do this, you will be saved. Now the state is saying that rather than using information simply to explain, through the practice of strategic communication, what we are going to do is we are going to influence the community through our action. This is more closely related, or probably linked, to the anarchist notion of propaganda of the deed than it is to traditional notions of persuasion, because in strategic communication, violent or coercive action is taken to communicate a threat to a broader community. And this is actually what the purpose of terrorism is: the use of violence in order to communicate a message to a broader set of people in order to enact a political change. So actually what the state is doing through its coercive and violent acts is something, maybe not terrorism in this respect, but certainly a disciplinary and violent form of activity. And we can see this in the latest complaints that are being made by government ministers against academics sharing their opinions and views. And what the government is doing by targeting these selective individuals is basically revealing two things: that one, they do not and will not tolerate criticism and critique of power within the domain of civil society, and also that their grip over power, a crisis, actually exists where they're losing that grip. Therefore, they are resorting to what they know, and the only thing that they know they can resort to, and that is coercion, violence. It's almost like when hegemony is at its weakest or most vulnerable, power holders are more likely to become engaged in violence to levels that they probably haven't engaged in the past. And I think Israel is a really good example of this, that the levels of depravity and the violence that is taking place is perhaps more indicative of the failure and the likely failure of the settler colonial apartheid project than actually Israel's success. It's becoming this violent because it perhaps has to, because it feels like it's under risk in a way that it's never been. And I think that's also applicable to the UK establishment, where it's now having to penetrate coercively civil society through counterterrorism framings in ways that it perhaps hasn't done in the past, in order to basically protect itself because it feels vulnerable. So again, we can see using selective forms of coercion and violence against ordinary members of civil society, like academics, for example, in order to discipline them, to regulate their behavior, to police their behavior, to get them to internalize, in the Foucauldian sense, their own behavior. Also, at the same time, we can see how surveillance through the prevent strategy has become completely normalized. So now we're not asking members of staff to report students reading primary documents on to the authorities. We're saying deal with it in-house, because what that does is it means the media won't come knocking on your door asking questions saying, why on earth have you arrested a postgraduate student for reading a book on terrorism or accessing primary literature? So rather than actually doing police work and catching individuals involved in plotting and conspiring, they're now forcing universities, because we're all under a legal pressure as academics, and if we don't comply, we're in contempt of court and we can be prosecuted. We're now being expected to do the policing for them. So again, we can see that distinction between civilian and military at play. in order to carry out ongoing and routine surveillance of ordinary behaviors. What are the sorts of behaviors that are being used to assess whether somebody is a future terrorist? Things like changing of your clothing to more religious attire. Right? We know that it's not punk rock clothing that's necessarily going to lead to this sort of investigation. And all the examples that are being used draw upon, for instance, Muslim clothing. So there's a huge racialized dimension at play in this respect. So if you adopt a more religious attire, if you are feeling isolated or alone, if you've been a victim of hate crime, all of these sorts of things alone, completely ordinary behaviors for young adolescents, especially at school, but also young university students. How many of our students are going through a mental health challenge or a crisis? So many. But if they are isolated, they've cut themselves off from university and their friends, and they're becoming more devout and more outwardly in their faith, somehow this should be triggering alarm bells. And I should be drawing on the advice of the state in order to assess whether they pose a risk to themselves and the public in the future. Now, I'm not qualified based on a 30-minute training program to take this sort of an action. I'm an academic. My job is to research and teach, not to look out for who's going to become a future terrorist. That's not something that I feel suitably qualified for. Yet that is exactly what is expected of me. Now, in this situation, when I am under threat from having some coercion directed against me for not doing that, I'm likely to adopt the mantra, it's better to be safe than sorry. I'd rather make the referral than not make the referral. And this practice is more dominant in educational school settings than it is universities. And that's why most of the referrals are coming through the education system, notably schools, and young children are being referred to the authorities. So the surveillance system relies upon the blurring of the boundary between civilian and military forces. Now, one thing, and I do want to start thinking about summing up here so we can get onto the Q&A, is that all of these different counterinsurgency practices have clearly been integrated. And this is something that I systematically document in the book. The 4 or 5 chapters in towards the latter part of the book, they detail and document exactly how that works. But one thing that people, especially military, more liberal soldier scholars or military theorists focus on, is how minimal force is used in counterinsurgency. So would you rather, Rizwaan, the argument goes, would you rather a more heavy-handed counterterrorism approach be used, or would you rather a counter-ideology approach be used, which relies on minimal force? So I'm not going to target, the soldier or the security practitioner, won't target the entire community with violence. I'll target my violence at those that are plotting or planning violence. And when it comes to the community, I will engage with them. I will try to win their hearts and minds and try to systematically engage with them in the domain of ideas. Now, this idea of counterinsurgency being a better form of warfare because it is less violent doesn't mean it is not warfare. It doesn't mean it is not coercive. In the words of David Kilcullen, a noted and influential counterinsurgency theorist, soldier scholar, part of General David Petraeus's The Surge in Iraq in 2007, make no mistake, quote, make no mistake, counterinsurgency is war and war is inherently violent, end quote. There you go. A noted counterinsurgency theorist saying the quiet part out loud. That yes, there is a great element of counter-ideology. Shooting and killing, executing, is only 20% of the strategy. 80% is non-violent. But just because it's non-violent doesn't necessarily mean that it's, one, not coercive, not disciplinary, or is actually based somehow on the liberation of racialized, predominantly communities in the world. It's not. So this myth minimizes the harm that emerges from these policies that operate within the domain of counter ideology. So, for example, oh, we're only here to talk to you about your ideas. You've not committed a criminal offense, which is increasingly now what's happening with Israel and Palestine. And all these videos are now emerging on social media where you can see police officers turning up to people's home. And you think, I wish you'd turned up that quickly when my home got burgled or my car got stolen. But somehow they find the resources to do this when someone sticks a Palestine flag out of their window. So the point here is that even though you are not committing a crime, you're still being spoken to. That still has a chilling effect and may discourage others from engaging in any such sort of activity, which again is that communicating a threat, undertaking an act that will communicate a threat to a broader audience or group. Again, that notion of strategic communication. So what all of these things do is they induce trauma. They induce fear. And this is something that these strategies of warfare, which are claimed to be more liberal or, so to speak, the lesser of two evils. Well, in the words of Hannah Arendt, when you choose the lesser of two evils, remember, you are still choosing evil. It's just lesser evil, right? So these policies, what they do is they seek to legitimize state violence and erase the harm that emerges from less violent policies, practices, and approaches, such as, for example, prevent, such as, for example, arresting someone in pre-charge detention, holding them for 7 days and then releasing them without charge, because the likelihood of securing a conviction in a court of law is very low, because that's how flimsy the case is, and because the people that are backing you are white scholars from a Russell Group institution. So these policies and practices that exist, they minimize that trauma. And one of the reasons of writing the book was to show, one, just because it's lawful violence does not stop this violence from being any less painful for me. If you abuse me because the law allows you to abuse me, I've still been abused. I'm still feeling pain. Right? And this is what makes it even more traumatizing, is that the state that you rely on to protect and safeguard you from these harms is the very agent of that trauma and that pain, which leads to even more, psychological and psychiatric problems in the long run. Who do you now rely on to protect and safeguard you? When I was 21 years old, taken into custody, the police were the good people. Yeah, they made mistakes. They did things that were wrong. They were systematically and institutionally riddled with some problems, but generally it's okay. And then you go in and you're accused of being this person, and you're thinking, hang on a minute, this entire orchard is rotten. This entire system is criminalizing you. And it's just a very, very sad reality that I had to be subjected to that level of violence in order to fully comprehend just how corrupt and riddled with racism and Islamophobia this entire system is. So through that experience and the trauma that it inevitably led to, because the trauma, it manifests itself in weird and different ways, things and ways that you just don't understand. And it happens when you least expect it. I mean, now I've understood this after enough psychological and psychiatric harm and problems. And this is something that I document in detail in the book, in order to show that just because it's lawful violence, just because it's based upon legality, does not lessen the pain or the harm that I am feeling. Or just because the state did it, it doesn't reduce the pain and the harm and the trauma that I now have to live with all of my life. So part and parcel of writing the book was to make visible, and this is my final point, it was to make visible how this area of policy operates and how we as a community must resist within the domain of civil society by making something visible. Because in a hegemonic system of power, how do we resist the idea that all Muslims are terrorists? We have to make visible the way that this policy works. To engage in this act of making something visible is to engage in counter-hegemony. And for me, writing the book was an act of counter-hegemony. It was to make visible how this system of common sense around terrorism and who the terrorist is is basically a way of doing that, to challenge what Stampnitsky calls anti-knowledge, the idea that somehow studying the terrorist or understanding the terrorist is actually something that is taboo and is not to be done. No, we are going to challenge this policy by making visible how it operates in order to ensure that this does not happen again. And I'll end with that particular point.
Thank you very much for that very powerful talk, Rizwaan. That's very much appreciated. Very scary, very important, especially at the moment. From my point of view, the saddest thing of it all is that it doesn't seem to have gotten much better. And that's really perhaps the saddest thing. So we're going to go over to questions now for the rest of the time we've got. So we've got about 40 minutes. So I've got a couple of hands up. I'll start with you, John.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Rizwaan, for sharing your story and for writing the book. And my comment is based on the fact that I played a very small part in your story. When this incident happened back in 2008, I was head of the public library service in Lincolnshire, not far away. And I led the campaign within the library profession to expose the impact of the so-called war on terror and the prevent strategy on public library services and on community relations, because it impacted both. But I was pretty much a lone voice, because other librarians said to me, what's this got to do with public libraries? It's got, what's it got to do with us? And then when your case happened, I used it unashamedly as a platform for educating my fellow librarians. And I called upon the Library Association and the Museums, Libraries and Archives Council to oppose the deportation of Hisham Yeza, who, as you say, was arrested for printing out this training manual. My question is going to be in a moment, what happened to him? Because as I understand it, he was facing detention and possible deportation to his native Algeria. But the point I made, and I wrote a letter to the bookseller, which caused a big hoo-ha in the profession, I said that Yeza's action had been taken in the context of assisting a postgraduate student with his legitimate studies, adding that the case highlights the disturbing tendency to criminalize the act of simply looking at extremist literature without examining the context. And no doubt, I said, this draconian act will serve as a warning to library staff. And that's exactly what happened. Because as you say, this thing about the civil and the military power, what happened was public library staff, even though I told them not to, started to police Muslim public library users. They started looking at the borrowing records. What books were Muslim people borrowing from the public library? They stopped buying anything to do with Muslim culture or history. No doubt worried that this was going to be some kind of, aiding terrorism in some way. Muslim programs in the public library were cancelled. Even though as the head of libraries, I was saying, don't do these things. And you can imagine elsewhere in the country where there wasn't a head of libraries campaigning in this way, this would have had a big knock-on effect across the whole public library sector. And as a result, many Muslim people stopped using the public library service. So the impact, it's like drop a pebble in a pond. The impact went kind of far and wide. But coming back to my question was, what did happen to Hisham Yeza?
Thank you for that contribution, John. Actually, you made some really important points. I'll answer your question in a second, because it's quite a wonderful story in one respect and also harrowing in another. But your points about the library are really interesting, because it just triggered another case study. The British Library refused to hold an archive of documents produced by the Taliban. The British Library, I think it's the world's largest library, refusing to hold a set of documents because they are afraid of having action taken against them under glorification or encouragement of terrorism. So, because obviously the intent doesn't count. Now, what happens to a social science student or scholar who wants to understand the Taliban insurgent movement in order to see how best to deal with these sorts of outbreaks of violence that are happening in the world. They can't. That black box around studying violent actors, non-state violent actors, has just been strengthened and fortified. In an age, in 2023, when we are perhaps at our most freest than we've ever been before in terms of information, we are still being denied some of the most basic things because of that coercive threat that is being issued through the existence of law to libraries, to educators, librarians, and scholars, and denying us the opportunity and the chance to actually engage with these sorts of ideas. But because it's through law, it's completely acceptable. So I completely take your point. And of course, thank you for your advocacy and work in order to protect these fundamental rights to read, which, to be honest with you, any system of tyranny or power tries to deny in order to enhance itself. In answer to your question, Hisham Yeza was released without charge from terrorism charges because he was innocent, but he was immediately rearrested on immigration charges. And this is something very common that we find with people who are released from terrorism charges, but are immediately rearrested on immigration charges because they're not British citizens, essentially. They're foreign nationals. And we can see this technique being used against so many other people who have been arrested for terrorism, subsequently rearrested on immigration, and then deported. And this is exactly the strategy that was being used against Hisham. Now, Hisham was very fortunate that he was able to mobilize support from the student community and academic members of staff, many who are in this meeting today, in order to put pressure on the Home Office and to stop his deportation. Eventually, we did stop the deportation, but he was convicted for an immigration offense and did serve time in prison. Now, what's interesting is once he had served his sentence in prison and he continued with his editorship of the Ceasefire magazine, which still, of course, exists today, and then eventually found himself in full-time employment working for the BBC monitoring department, and which he is there now a full-time member of staff, and he's happy being there, providing excellent commentary and analysis on his area of specialism, which is predominantly North Africa. So somebody who the state tried to immediately remove from the UK through deportation and essentially silence, which is what the act of this deportation was intended to do, actually went on to serve prison and then to be released and then be hired by one of the most prestigious, arguably, media organizations in the United Kingdom, in fact, the world, and then provide commentary on television to the likes of John Simpson and other liberal mainstream journalists about what's happening in the world. So it just shows you that these are the sorts of people that the state targets and has this one approach that it tries to use, and that is coercion.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Andreas.
Yeah, hi, Rizwaan. Thanks a lot for your excellent presentation, but also, first of all, maximum respect to you, to have come through and become the scholar you are, despite this kind of assault on you, the violence you've experienced. That is massive. So maximum respect to you for that achievement. Now, you talk very much outline the kind of domestic implications of this lawful, inverted commas, activities. You mentioned almost as a byword the kind of roots in the colonial administration or the imperialist system Britain was a key player in. Could you just, out of interest, expand a bit on that, how that also relates to the British colonial past, please?
Okay, well, firstly, thank you very much for your kind words. And I know Anthony's in the meeting, and I know Vanessa is as well. And I just want to give a shout out to both and yourself for the support that you provided. And at the time, I was a very naive 21-year-old, and had it not been for the wisdom and support and encouragement of people like yourself, maybe I wouldn't have been the brave, strong person that you say I am. So I just want to, I want that to be noted officially. I genuinely appreciate, I've not forgotten, and I never will, the support that you provided. So thank you. Colonial counterinsurgency is basically the existence of a series of policies that we see being applied today, but that are rooted in imperial systems of power and governance. So the way that society is organized, with whites at the top and everyone who's not white being somewhere in between, with blacks at the bottom, is something that goes back to the colonial expansions that take place starting in around the 1400s, pre-Enlightenment. So the idea here is to construct a world and based upon skin color, and to then police that world using violence and coercion and the innovations in military technology that is made by the Western world, in order to ensure that that system continues to serve you in predominantly economic terms. Now, that colonial policing and regulation doesn't just operate through violence, but actually, initially, if we take the East India Company in India as an example, operates through economics, which immediately reminds me of that Clausewitzian saying that violence is simply the means. The subjugation of our enemy is the end goal. Now, if you can get the Indian rulers to essentially succumb to all of your demands through non-violent economic means, why do we need to use violence? And this is essentially the core of counterinsurgency, especially population-centric counterinsurgency, the sort of that says, well, the grievances that insurgents represent are legitimate. It's just the way you go about it that we don't like. So what we will do is we will address some of your grievances, but we're going to kill and capture the people who engage in politics that we don't like. So what we can see is that the methods of resistance or resistance is generally denied. And it's as long as you accept what we are saying and doing, that's fine. There's an example to show how this works. So the concept of moderate and extremist, which is central to the discourse of counterterrorism and counter-extremism today, is something that actually emerges in colonial India. And it emerges in the context of those who wanted land reform whilst the British remained in British India, and those who were trying to expel the British from India in total. And those were the ones that were called the so-called radicals or the extremists. And the moderates were the ones who said, no, we can reform this system, who had a more liberal take on resistance. So something as simple as that framing is used today to frame the discourse. Again, we can see the same logics at play when it comes to engaging community leaders. So in the Muslim community, there's this whole notion that we need to engage with Muslim community leaders. These leaders do not exist. They have no sway or say over the community. They largely represent a very small constituency that is based upon clan or caste lines, and that's about it. But when it comes down to engaging with young people who are engaging in politics, who are dissatisfied with the system, they do not have those people's ear. The only reason that the UK government tries to use that approach is because historically that's what it did, by using what was defined as the Western-oriented gentleman in order to sell and persuade the broader Indian community, the WOG, to side with what the British state was doing. So we can see the continuation of this legacy in not only how we view the threat, in how we view the problem, but also in the responses of the state. And this is where British thinking is quite profound compared to other governments and states. So, for example, the American model of counterinsurgency, which draws its lessons from Vietnam, actually is not able to utilize the distinction between the good and the bad Muslim in the same way as the British are, because the British have been awfully good at doing this throughout history, is representing and showing themselves to be dedicated to helping those who are the good Muslims compared to the bad Muslims. And this is a legacy that has continued until this day. But the problem now is that with, you know, second and third generation Muslims emerging in Britain today and other parts of Europe, is that distinction between good citizenship and bad citizenship is becoming more blurred, because people like myself are always and constantly advocating for the rights of the powerless because I have citizenship, but that automatically then makes me a bad citizen, which, because of my racialized identity, makes me vulnerable to having that citizenship potentially revoked. So even though I have the rights and the liberties, hard won oftentimes in my case, but nevertheless have them, they're constantly at risk. And they're at risk by a state that believes that you should be a good Muslim. You should be a moderate Muslim. And that logic emerges from the colonial experience and encounter. Sorry for waffling too much, Andreas.
No, thanks a lot. Very good. Cheers.
Excellent response. Vanessa, over to you.
Yeah. Hi, Rizwaan. Let me just check if my volume's up. You know, great talk, Rizwaan, and it's really interesting seeing how your ideas have really clarified over the development of counterterrorism. Really, really fascinating. I suppose one of my sort of questions relates to the sort of paradox around, on the one hand, you have this huge expansive development, and certainly on paper, the integration of what would in the past have been the sort of military security side, then with civil society, including the NHS and so at one level it's a sort of total system, but on the other hand it's utterly hollow, because if we think of some of the things like that academics prevent duty, the reality is, you know, our seminars, you know, our lectures might be, say, at a Russell Group University might be 300 students, 400 students. Our seminars are not 10 students or even 15 or even 20. They're now potentially 30 students. And not only that, now with things like QR code governance, you know, we don't know our students' names, that, you know, we don't have a sort of a physical register and so on. So there's I mean, it's been examined elsewhere, but essentially we have a form of governance at a distance, and I you know, I would be clueless about my students' views because I've got so many. And so in terms of both identifying students who do have terrorist inclinations, or, you know, as in the tragic case of the student who killed two students, or former student that killed two people. I mean, we don't know what's going on with our students on the one hand, so in terms of a prevent side, and then in terms of, say, defending a student such as you, or you know, saying that the student is of good character, and you know, something's gone wrong here. We also wouldn't know the student today in the same way that we might have done 15 years ago. So wrapping that all up in a question, I suppose, on the one hand, you have the sort of integration of all these different systems and so on, but on the other hand, so that you've got all this integration, but on the other hand, it's a very sort of hollow governance at a distance, and it isn't doing, you know, prevent isn't preventing. You know, today with you know, with Cameron back in government, people are raising the question of Libya. Well, Abedi, the Manchester bomber, could go backwards and forwards seemingly at ease. And clearly it was a very hollow governance. At the same time, we have this massive integration.
Yeah, no, I think I agree completely with you, Vanessa, on the unworkability of this policy. But I think your point around that paradox, around the hollowness and the fact that the distance creates this sense of vulnerability, but I think that's applicable perhaps more in a university setting.
Yeah.
I think universities are slightly different to all of the other institutions. And that's not because I'm at a university. I just think there is a lot more independence that is given to the student body who are young adults who are engaging with these sorts of areas in their study, for example, or are encouraged to attend societies and be part of the conversation. So I think universities are a little bit different. And I do agree that the rise of technology and registers, for example, means we don't, but also the way that universities work, and more of them are focused on larger numbers and producing more graduates, basically means that there is now more distance between ourselves as staff members and university students. So inevitably, you cannot know everyone. But I suppose what the policy seeks to do is target certain groups more than others. And I think school children are a prime target in this regard, and school teachers are a prime target under this policy. And we can find that through the stats, which show most referrals are coming from schools and educational setting, but also the disciplinary effect that it creates. And I am not willing to accept that power holders and policymakers in the Home Office, in communities and local government, in the Foreign Office, are unaware of the discourse that says these sorts of policies create a chilling effect and a disciplinary impact on communities. We know that they know that it does. This is box standard A-level, GCSE level sociology, right? So I think part and parcel, there's a few dynamics here. One is institutions are very risk averse and they want to ensure that they cannot be litigated against. So in order to reduce the risk of litigation, they will roll out the prevent strategy. They will roll out the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism without any thought process and not realizing the chilling effect that this creates, right? But they're doing that in order to reduce the risk of them being litigated. So I think that's got a role to play, especially within university settings. And in a school setting, it's more structured around safeguarding. So we're saying, oh, we're not trying to harm the student, we're trying to protect the student. So even if you are reporting them, remember, you're reporting them in the same respect that you would be reporting them if they were addicted to cocaine or heroin. We're trying to protect and safeguard them from these horrible ills like drugs and terrorism. So they're conflating both things together. But what I think one of the outcomes, the inevitable outcomes of this policy is, and yes, it is hollow, but at the same time, it disciplines. It creates that understanding among students that if they speak out of place, there is a likelihood that somebody may come and take my children away. So it's not that the children are being disciplined, it's the parents are being disciplined. And if you speak to racialized communities and parents in predominantly largely Muslim areas like Birmingham or East London, for example, one of their biggest fears is that their child will go to school and repeat something that their parent has said in the privacy of their living room, and that will subsequently lead to some sort of prevent investigation. And I think rolling out the policy within these spaces and then policing and regulating that is a way of basically disciplining entire segments of the community in a way that you cannot then prove has actually happened. Because how do you prove that someone is self-disciplining until they tell you they are self-disciplining? You can't empirically measure it. And if it can't be empirically measured in our world, then it doesn't exist. So as a result, the policy has a chilling effect. They know that it has a chilling effect. They know it's also unworkable, especially at a university level. But I don't think universities are the main target. I think schooling and families are the main target of this particular policy, and it's having the desired effect. Even my cousins, family members who have children, don't talk about or try to say, qualify their political statements to their children in case they say something and the police come knocking. And they will come knocking, as they have in many instances where children have spoken about computer games or Fortnite or guns in my shed when they're talking about a computer game and all sorts. So it's happening. And I think even though it's hollow and unworkable in many respects, it's also disciplinary, and I think it's having the desired effect.
I mean, just to come back on that, I mean, I would agree with that, and that would tie in with critiques of other people in terms of governance at a distance, that it has its sort of coercive disciplinary side, but and perniciousness is in its governance at a distance, which is risk averse rather than making more grounded judgments. Because they don't do the judgments because they're not near. It's a form of risk aversion that leads actually to more coercion than policies that might be based more on specific government of a problem, as opposed to this sort of governance at a distance, and increasingly based on algorithms and so on. Yeah.
And that's becoming even worse now with tech and AI. I mean, to prevent referrals are one thing, but, you know, even with drone warfare, for example, just to go slightly off topic, but the kill cloud is increasingly based upon artificial intelligence dictating who is a threat. But AI systems generally can't distinguish between what is a real weapon and a child holding a toy gun. In that case, both are fair game, right? So the systems just aren't able to cope with the reality of people and communities, yet they're all being kind of provided as this kind of silver bullet panacea that exists and will remove all the problems and shortcomings in the world. But there we go.
Thank you, Rizwaan. If I can abuse chair's privileges, then I don't see any other questions asked at the moment. You know, your talk is really powerful, and your whole story, Rizwaan. You know, I think it needs to be heard as far as possible, and it's just so important for people to know about what you've been through, but also what continues to go on. I mean, obviously, I'm at Nottingham University doing my PhD, and the university tries to portray itself as a very progressive, very inclusive environment. And yet, knowing your story, I mean, the fact that you mentioned the Palestinian Solidarity Society was conducted surveillance. I'm just wondering, now you've experienced life in academia, you've got your PhD, you're a lecturer. How optimistic are you? How much has changed? Is there reason to be confident? I mean, all this talk about, EDI and inclusivity and all this that the university push, is it for real or is it just spiel?
Wow, that is an excellent question that you have just asked, Oliver. Let me put it this way to you. Life gives you difficulties. I'm going to be a slight philosopher here, right? Just humor me for a second. Life gives you certain challenges and difficulties, and it makes you a strong person. And then it gives you some benefits and it gives you some privileges. That's the beauty of our system. That's how it sustains itself despite all the criticism, right? And we get comfortable and we start to lose that sense of reality and the horridness of the structures that exist. But then something happens that brings you right back to earth with a click of a finger. And it's called the Israel-Palestine issue re-emerges. And you say something publicly on Twitter, and that's it. You're under investigation because a complaint has been received by the university, issued by a government department. And before you can say or do anything, you are back to being that stupid, naive 21-year-old who spoke too soon. And all of those privileges and rights that you think are going to safeguard and protect you are immediately removed, and you find yourself wobbling. And this is the reality of my life. That yes, being in a university situation brings its benefits and brings its privileges in many respects. Hard-won privileges and benefits, I have to add. I almost never was here. Had I not had the support of friends, family, and academics. And had I not had the resilience that I do, I wouldn't be here. So it was hard won. But also, now that it is hard won and I've understood the difficulties in getting here, it's not guaranteed. Power is constantly trying to trip resistance up. It's constantly at the neck of resistance. It takes a constant struggle. Am I positive and hopeful about the future? I'm realistic. Unfortunately, I've been in university settings now for a long time. Unfortunately, my understanding of the world is not getting any brighter. I think part of this is systemic, and I think this is sector-wide, and I know this will resonate with a lot of colleagues here today, but just the way that universities are governed does not encourage critical thinking. It's all about style as opposed to substance. We are increasingly bothered about monetizing our institutions. We are increasingly bothered about having brown and black faces on our publicity materials rather than actually having the processes in place to provide and support these students. We're using them to profiteer. It's classic exploitation. And the students that are engaging with us and try to come to university and learn are struggling because they have been failed by an education system, which has not taught them properly how to read and write. So by the time they get to us and we're saying, right, go away and write a 12,000-word dissertation, they don't know where to start. And they're having panic attacks as a result. And some of them go even further. We know the stories of students who have struggled and have taken their own life because of the pressures of university. And I think the system has to be deconstructed and recreated. You've got to dismantle it. I don't think we can reform this as it currently is because of the systemic level, the levels of systemic problems that exist. And I want to be hopeful that somehow the university is the panacea and that will cure the world. I think the university still offers some space. This venue is an example of that. But do I think universities will be at the forefront of the revolution? No, I don't. And I think people in academia need to understand that it's actually community action. And unless we as a university are aligned with communities and we're using our resources and our knowledge and our expertise to support communities, we will always remain these out of touch. I don't want to use the word ivory towers because it's overused, but we'll remain out of touch with what's happening on the ground. And I think one of the things that I've tried to do all of my professional life is to maintain that contact with those elements of society that probably academics aren't engaging with as much, because not only do they keep you real, but they also show you that when shit hits the fan, pardon the pun, that they're the ones generally who will put their neck on the line, and they will do it without fear because their livelihood does not depend upon towing the line that a university wants you to tow. And I think as hopeful as I am, as thankful as I am that I am in the position that I am in, I'm also very conscious of the problems sector-wide that exist, and also that a lot of the time, a lot of the change that we want to see as colleagues and scholars is not going to just happen by being present here, but it's actually going to happen with partnerships with community groups. And I think that's where the power lies. That's where mobilization power lies.
Very, very well said, Rizwaan. Just one small correction. We at the CSSGJ are no longer part of any university. To just back up, the situation is becoming increasingly difficult, and it was made clear to us in no uncertain terms that we were no longer welcome at Nottingham University for the.
Well, the fact that you're getting me on, no wonder why you're not welcome. If you're going to get these sorts of voices on, of course, no institution really wants people to be engaging in counter hegemony. That's the truth. So unless you are producing something of applied value that is going to bring in research funding, if you're an anti-racist, you ain't of no use to anyone other than the community. So the university then is going to think, well, what use are you? What use is your anti-racism, your anti-imperialism, if it's not bringing in research funding? So you're not benefiting the neoliberal system. So as a result, they don't want you. But don't worry, we want you. I think I think it was Fanon who said colonialism is violence in its most naked form. Or I'm butchering the quote. You'll have to forgive me. It's late. But no, I don't think it's ignorance. I think it's a project. I think imperialism relies upon a combination of naked violence, and abuse, and at the same time, it relies upon carrots. And I think there is no shortage of literature or commentary by academics, by scholars, by pundits, by anti-race activists, by lawyers, which says these are the problems with your policy and this is what's happening. I think a lot of the time people start to believe their own bullshit. And I think that's got something to do with this, that these lies have been repeated so many times that these policymakers and government officials have actually genuinely started to believe that they are not to blame for what's happening in the world. So I think people have internalized their own lies, and I think that's the biggest problem. But what I am hopeful about, and this comes back to Oliver's point, and I hope empowers you, because the point is not to disempower you, but to try and empower you, is that I think the horridness in the world is increasing in many respects, though I've not been around long enough in history to know that horrors have always existed. I think the world's just being the world, and that is horrid. But what I am confident and positive about, especially when it comes to Israel and Palestine, is this shift in the public discourse, that the levels of critique and information within the domain, especially of information, it's unrivaled. Like, I don't remember the levels of confidence and clarity of argument offered by the pro-Palestinian movement and anti-imperialists until this day. The levels of unity that are being shown by the anti-imperialist camp, by anti-apartheid activists. And I think part and parcel of that is connected innately to the fact that Israel and Palestine has now been happening for nearly a century. And people have eventually started to wake up to the idea that, well, it can't just be the firing of rockets. There's something more at play here. I think that long history has allowed people to pontificate and think. But I think also there is now a new generation of people empowered by the rise of technology that is democratized, and they are using that to their advantage. And I think no matter how powerful Israel's weapon systems may be, how autonomous they may be, Israel is losing the information war. And that's why it's getting more and more vulgar, more and more desperate, and more obvious in the lies and obfuscations that it uses to conceal the terror that it inflicts upon children every day. So I think going away from this talk, I think we should all be positive, and I think we should all be, I'm trying to be a part of it on, for example, through writing and social media and public speaking like this, to not be afraid to call this out for what it is. Using the word genocide triggers people who engage in genocide. And of course it triggers them, because nobody wants to be accused of engaging in genocide, especially and ironically when the actual phrase was created by Raphael Lemkin, who was actually a Jewish person, a Jewish lawyer himself, referring to the Nazi Holocaust. So this hurts. And I think part and parcel of our resistance of being privileged in the West is to use our freedom and liberty to speak, and to not, or to certainly try our best to not be afraid. And I think here is where solidarity is absolutely priceless, because when one person speaks, we can be silenced. When we all speak, we can't be silenced. Then it's a big problem for power. Then it starts doing stupid things, which is what it's doing now. But as a community, and I talk about this in the book, the different strategies of resistance, one of them is finding community and finding solidarity with global networks, not just local in the UK, because what we find is happening in, for example, the policing of Ferguson, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in India, all of these different struggles are connected. So we can learn, in the words of Angela Davis, all the way from Ferguson to Palestine, how we understand and diagnose the problem, but how we resist, more importantly.
Very well said. What a fantastic way to end, Rizwaan. You know, I'm sure I speak on behalf of Tony and Andreas here that it really has been an absolute pleasure, and so so important to have you here, particularly at this time as well, given what's going on and the way that Islamophobia is being weaponized to justify genocide in Palestine and to promote British foreign policy operations. So I really hope that this talk is seen and given the due that it's deserved, because it is such an important talk, and it's been I've enjoyed every second of it. So thank you for your time, Rizwaan.
Thank you, Oliver, for having me. Andreas, Tony, it's wonderful to see you. Vanessa, I've not seen you in ages, but you know what? It's been really great to see you, and thank you so much for having me. Honestly, it feels actually really nice to see you all. Look after yourself, and maybe drop me a message outside of this platform. Maybe we should all grab a coffee sometime. That would be amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Rizwaan. That was fantastic.
Take care. See you later. Bye bye.
All the best. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye bye. Bye bye.